Picture this. It's spring in the Chiricahua Mountains of what we now call Arizona, and the desert is about to reveal one of its most closely guarded secrets. Apache women are gathering around plants that look like nothing more than spiky, dangerous weeds to the untrained eye. But these aren't weeds, these are mescal plants, and what's about to happen next represents 500 years of accumulated wisdom about survival in one of North America's most unforgiving landscapes. The women work with knives and digging sticks, carefully extracting the hearts of these agave plants. Each heart weighs about as much as a bowling ball, and they'll collect dozens of them. Then comes the real magic. They dig pits in the earth, line them with rocks, and build fires that burn for hours until those stones glow red-hot. The mescal hearts go into these natural ovens, covered with grass mats and buried under dirt. For 3 days, the earth itself becomes a slow cooker, transforming bitter, fibrous plant hearts into sweet, nutritious cakes that taste something like molasses candy. Think about that for a moment. 3 days of patient cooking, using nothing but stone, fire, and earth. The result? Food that can sustain entire families through winter. This isn't just survival, this is sophisticated food technology developed over centuries by people who understood their environment in ways we can barely comprehend today. This is how the Apache lived in 1850, not the Hollywood version of wild savages you might imagine, but as highly skilled people who had turned the Sonoran Desert into their garden. Children could identify 47 different edible plants before they learned to read English. Warriors hunted deer and elk with prayers of gratitude, understanding that taking life required acknowledging the gift. Elders taught that the land itself was their grandmother, not property to be owned, but family to be honored. Into this world came the Americans, and with them a man named Cochise. Cochise was everything the Apache respected in a leader: tall, dignified, diplomatic. He wanted peace with these new people flooding into Apache territory. He met with American officials, shook hands, made agreements. He probably thought he understood how civilization worked. After all, the Apache had been dealing with Spanish colonists and Mexican settlers for generations. You make agreements, you honor them. Life goes on. Then came Apache Pass. In 1861, Cochise agreed to meet with American soldiers under a flag of truce. He brought his brother, his nephews, some of his best warriors. They sat down to talk, probably shared food, discussed how Apache and Americans could live as neighbors. And then the Americans accused Cochise of kidnapping a white child, something he hadn't done, and tried to arrest him and his family. Cochise escaped, but his relatives didn't. The Americans hanged his brother and nephews from oak trees, their bodies left swaying in the desert wind as a message to all Apache people about American justice. You want to understand why the Apache Wars lasted 25 years? Start right there, at Apache Pass, with the sound of rope creaking in the wind. If Cochise represented Apache diplomacy, then Mangas Coloradas embodied Apache strength. Picture a man 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average American stood 5 feet 6. Mangas Coloradas, his name meant red sleeves, commanded respect through physical presence alone. When he spoke, scattered Apache bands listened. He dreamed of uniting all Apache people into a confederation that could negotiate with Americans from a position of strength. That dream died when American miners captured him, tied him to a tree, and whipped him until his back was raw meat, simply because they could, simply because he was Apache. Think about the historical irony here. These were people who had successfully adapted to life in the Sonoran Desert for 5 centuries. They had developed sustainable food systems, complex social structures, and diplomatic relationships with multiple neighbors. They understood ecology better than any university-trained scientist of 1860, and Americans treated them like animals. The response was swift and devastating. Apache war parties began striking throughout the Southwest with surgical precision. They perfected the art of guerrilla warfare generations before Che Guevara was born. Small groups of warriors could appear anywhere, strike hard, and vanish into landscapes they knew better than their own hands. They moved at night, left no tracks on stone, and could survive for weeks on cactus fruit and rainwater. Leading many of these raids was a man whose sister possessed an ability that sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but was documented by multiple sources. Lozan could sense enemies at vast distances. She would stand on hilltops, arms outstretched, and slowly turn in circles until her palms grew warm, indicating the direction of approaching soldiers. Victorio, her brother, and one of the most brilliant military tacticians in Apache history, never made a major decision without consulting her supernatural radar. But the name that would become synonymous with Apache resistance wasn't Cochise or Mangus Coloradas or even Victorio. It was Geronimo. Geronimo started life as Goyathle, which meant one who yawns. He was a medicine man, not a chief, content to heal the sick and speak with spirits. Then Mexican soldiers attacked his camp while the men were away trading. When Geronimo returned, he found his mother's body, his wife's body, the bodies of his 3 children. That night, a grieving husband and father died. What emerged was something else entirely. The transformation of Geronimo from peaceful medicine man to legendary warrior represents one of those moments when personal trauma intersects with historical forces to create mythology. For the next 20 years, his name would spread terror from Arizona to Mexico City. Lightning raids launched from hidden camps in Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains. Sudden attacks followed by disappearances so complete that pursuing soldiers wondered if they had been chasing ghosts. The numbers tell the story of Apache military effectiveness. 35 warriors, think about that. Roughly the population of a modern high school classroom kept 5,000 American and Mexican troops busy for months at a time. They survived on cactus fruit and horse meat, carried everything they owned on their backs, and moved through terrain that would challenge modern special forces equipped with GPS and helicopters. How do you fight an enemy like that? The American answer was as brilliant as it was morally questionable. Turn Apache against Apache. The army began recruiting Apache scouts, promising them fair treatment if they hunted their own people. Some did it to protect their families. Others believed cooperation offered the only path to survival. All were caught in an impossible situation with no good choices. These Apache scouts knew every hiding place, every water source, every escape route their targets might use. They could track warriors across solid rock and anticipate movements with uncanny accuracy. It was like having GPS and satellite reconnaissance combined with intimate local knowledge. Even then, it took years. The final chapter began in 1886 at a place called Skeleton Canyon. General Nelson Miles met with Geronimo under another flag of truce. This time, the promises were specific. 2 years in Florida, then return to Arizona. Just 2 years, the general assured him. 2 years, and this would all be over. Geronimo looked at his remaining followers, 17 warriors, 14 women, 6 children, 37 people, all that remained of bands that once numbered in the thousands. His medicine told him the promises were lies, but what choice did he have? His people were exhausted, hungry, surrounded. He laid down his rifle and spoke words that would prove more prophetic than anyone imagined. I am through with fighting. My heart is sick and sad. What Geronimo didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that General Miles was indeed lying, not just about the length of imprisonment, but about everything. The Apache prisoners wouldn't spend 2 years in Florida. They would spend 27 years in exile, and some of them would never see Arizona again. As those cattle cars pulled away from Skeleton Canyon, carrying Apache families toward an unimaginable fate, one of the most sophisticated indigenous cultures in North America was about to discover what American civilization really meant for people who refused to disappear quietly into the history books. The question you should be asking yourself right now is this: what happens when you take people whose entire identity is built around intimate knowledge of desert survival and lock them in humid swamps on the other side of the continent? The answer will break your heart. September heat in Arizona can kill you, but at least it's honest about its intentions. The heat that greeted 500 Apache prisoners as they were loaded into cattle cars was different. It carried the weight of betrayal, the suffocating knowledge that every promise made at Skeleton Canyon was already broken before the train wheels started turning. Imagine being packed into those cattle cars, not passenger cars, mind you, actual livestock transport cars with wooden slats for walls and no seats, packed so tightly that children had to take turns breathing at the narrow window slits. Adults stood pressed against each other for hours, then days, as the train rolled eastward through landscapes that meant nothing to people whose entire spiritual geography was rooted in desert mountains and sacred springs. The practical realities were nightmarish. No stops for bathroom needs, vomit and human, waste accumulating on the floor as motion sickness and terror took their toll. Babies crying for water their mothers couldn't provide because there wasn't enough for anyone. The stench must have been overwhelming. Hundreds of unwashed bodies, waste, fear, sweat, and despair, all mixing in the stifling air of those rolling prisons. But here's what really captures the surreal horror of this journey. At every station where the train stopped, crowds gathered, not to help, not to protest, but to gawk, to catch a glimpse of the savage Geronimo through the cattle car slats. Local newspapers advertised the train's schedule. Vendors sold peanuts and lemonade to spectators who came to stare at caged human beings like they were exotic animals in a traveling zoo. Think about that dynamic for a moment. Inside the cars, proud warriors who had once commanded vast territories sat in chains, watching their world disappear mile by steel mile. Outside, American families pointed and whispered, maybe took photographs. Certainly went home with stories about seeing the famous Apache prisoners. Two completely different experiences of the same moment, one group losing everything, the other group being entertained by that loss. The real cruelty began when the train started making stops. At different stations, families were torn apart with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed the Nazis. Geronimo and 15 other leaders were diverted to Fort Pickens, Florida, separated from their families and sent to what amounted to solitary confinement. Women and children continued to Fort Marion, an ancient Spanish fortress where they would learn what humidity could do to desert lungs. But the most heartbreaking separation happened when 112 Apache children were pulled from their mothers' arms and loaded onto different trains bound for Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Picture that scene. Mothers who had already lost husbands, brothers, homes, and homeland, now watching soldiers drag their children away. The children crying, reaching back toward women they didn't know they might never see again. The mothers screaming in Apache words the soldiers couldn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. Please don't take my babies. At Carlisle, those children would be forbidden to speak Apache. Their long hair would be shorn in the belief that cutting hair would somehow cut their connection to their culture. Their names that connected them to family stories, to spiritual meanings, to their very identity, would be replaced with American names chosen by strangers. A boy named Little Eagle might become Robert. A girl called Singing Bird might become Mary. Meanwhile, at Fort Marion, the ancient Spanish fortress became a tropical prison where desert people discovered what it felt like to drown in air. If you've ever been to Florida in summer, you know about humidity. But imagine experiencing that humidity after a lifetime in Arizona's dry heat. Imagine lungs evolved for desert air, suddenly forced to process atmosphere that feels more like breathing soup than breathing air. The Apache called it thick air that fights you. Medical reports described grown men gasping like fish out of water, simply trying to breathe normally. The Spanish had built Fort Marion to withstand Caribbean hurricanes, which meant thick stone walls and tiny windows, perfect for keeping out cannonballs, terrible for ventilation. Inside those walls, desert people suffocated in air so thick with moisture that their clothes never dried, their bedding stayed perpetually damp, and mold grew on everything, including inside their lungs. The food made everything worse. Army cooks served salt, pork floating in grease. Imagine the shock to digestive systems, accustomed to lean venison and rabbit, beans that smelled spoiled because they'd been stored in the humid heat for months, white bread that turned to paste in mouths that remembered the complex, flavors of acorn cakes and pine nut stews. Everything was too salty, too greasy, too foreign for bodies that had evolved eating desert plants and clean game. Disease spread through the prison like wildfire through dry grass. Tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, each claiming lives weekly. The death records make for grim reading. Died of consumption, died of fever, died of dysentery, died of dysentery, died of consumption. The same causes, over and over, like a bureaucratic drumbeat of cultural extinction. Children died calling for mothers imprisoned 800 miles away at Fort Pickens. Mothers died never knowing what happened to children shipped to Pennsylvania. The narrative threads of families, the stories that connect generations, were being cut with surgical precision by geographical separation and bureaucratic indifference. Individual tragedies tell the larger story better than statistics ever could. Chapo, Geronimo's son, wasting away from tuberculosis in the thick Florida air, coughing blood while dreaming of Arizona mountains. Lozan, the woman warrior who had evaded thousands of American and Mexican soldiers for years, dying of pneumonia in an Alabama prison hospital, her supernatural ability to sense enemies useless against microscopic bacteria. Babies born in captivity who would never feel desert sun on their faces, never hear traditional lullabies, never learn the names of plants that could heal or feed them. 800 miles away at Fort Pickens, a different kind of death was occurring. Tourists paid 25 cents to photograph Geronimo, making bows and arrows, traditional Apache weapons, turned into tourist souvenirs. The great warrior, who had once struck terror across 2 nations, reduced to a circus attraction to earn money for extra food because prison rations left everyone hungry. Picture him sitting there, carving wood and stringing sinew while strangers pointed cameras at him. Did he remember teaching his sons to make their first bows? Did he think about hunting expeditions in the Sierra Madre, when a well-made bow meant survival for his people? Now it meant quarters in a tin cup, payment for performing his own culture for people who saw him as a curiosity. The photographs from that period are disturbing to look at today. Geronimo's face shows a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness, the exhaustion of a man forced to perform his own defeat day after day for pocket change. By 1894, when authorities finally decided to move the survivors to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the mathematics of cultural destruction were clear. 119 Apaches had died in those humid prisons, nearly 1/4 of the original prisoners, not from warfare, not from violence, but from the simple biological fact that desert people cannot survive in swamps. The survivors who boarded trains for Oklahoma were fundamentally different from the people who had left Arizona 8 years earlier. They had watched their children die of diseases with foreign names. They had buried friends and relatives in soil that felt nothing like home. They had learned that American promises meant nothing, that American kindness was often more dangerous than American hostility. But perhaps most tragically, they had begun to forget the taste of traditional foods, the sound of traditional songs, the feeling of being connected to land that knew their names. Oklahoma would present new challenges, new forms of cultural assault disguised as kindness, and at the center of it all would be a phenomenon that sounds almost absurd until you understand its deeper meaning: grown Apache warriors weeping over fried chicken. What could possibly be traumatic about comfort food? The answer reveals everything about what had been lost and what was still being taken away. October 1894 brought 341 Apache survivors to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where they encountered something perhaps more psychologically devastating than outright cruelty: American kindness. General Hugh Scott, the new commanding officer, genuinely believed he could succeed where others had failed. Unlike his predecessors, Scott studied Apache culture, learned some of their language, and implemented what he considered a humane approach to managing Indian prisoners. He allowed them to live in village clusters rather than barracks, gave them plots of land to farm, and even permitted some traditional ceremonies. On paper, it looked like progress. The reality was more complicated, and it began with food. Army cooks at Fort Sill, wanting to treat these prisoners well, served what they considered good American food: golden fried chicken, aromatic and crispy, sweet apple pie with cinnamon and butter crusts, fluffy mashed potatoes swimming in rich gravy. To American palates, this was comfort food at its finest, the kind of hearty, satisfying meals that represented prosperity and care. The first time aged warrior Nana tasted that fried chicken, witnesses later said, tears streamed down his weathered face. But these weren't tears of gratitude. They weren't tears of joy at finally receiving decent treatment. They were tears of grief so profound that other Apache looked away, understanding something the well-meaning cooks could never comprehend. Think about what that piece of fried chicken represented to a man like Nana, who had been fighting since 1820. The crunch of the golden coating reminded him of grasshoppers roasted over mesquite fires with his grandmother when he was 6 years old. Grasshoppers they had caught together during summer evenings, preparing them with wild herbs, whose names he could barely remember now. The texture, the sound, the very act of biting through crispy exterior to reach tender meat inside all of it, triggered memories of a food culture that was dying with each American meal served on army plates. The richness of butter and lard nauseated stomachs that had evolved eating lean game and sparse desert plants. Apache digestive systems, adapted to survive on minimal resources, rebelled against the heavy American diet. Men and women who had once sustained themselves on pine nuts, cactus fruits, and carefully rationed deer meat found themselves sick from foods that Americans considered treats. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the cultural assault that each meal represented. Apple pie's overwhelming sweetness mocked memories of gathering piñon nuts with children who had died in Florida prisons. The soft bread reminded them of traditional seed cakes made from plants they might never see again. Every bite was a reminder of disconnection, of cultural amputation. Women tried desperately to maintain some connection to traditional foodways by establishing gardens, planting anything they could obtain that resembled familiar plants. But Oklahoma soil rejected desert species like the land itself knew these plants didn't belong here. Yucca roots rotted in humid earth. Wild spinach varieties withered in soil that retained too much moisture. Even familiar weeds grew differently, tasting wrong, providing inadequate nutrition. Picture these women, who had once been walking encyclopedias of desert botany, reduced to coaxing foreign vegetables from alien soil. Women who could identify healing properties of dozens of native plants now struggled to grow simple beans and squash. Their expertise, developed over generations of survival in harsh environments, had become suddenly completely useless. The psychological landscape at Fort Sill was equally foreign. 12 scattered villages, named after dead chiefs, where prisoners built American-style houses while artillery units used their cornfields for target practice. Think about that image. Apache families trying to establish some semblance of normal life, while army cannons exploded in their gardens, serving as daily reminders that they existed at the pleasure of their captors. Geronimo's humiliation during this period was particularly systematic. His exhibition tours became a regular feature of American entertainment, the St. Louis World's Fair, where he sold autographs for a quarter each, the Omaha exhibition where crowds gawked at the tamed savage, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show where he performed staged battles against actors playing cavalry soldiers. Each performance generated income that funded extra food for his people, because prison rations left everyone constantly hungry. But imagine what these performances cost him psychologically. A man who had once been one of the most feared warriors on the continent, reduced to signing his name for tourists and pretending to fight battles he had lost decades earlier. Every autograph was a small surrender. Every staged fight was a reenactment of his own defeat. The intimate moments at Fort Sill reveal the deeper tragedy. Mothers teaching daughters to make bread from government flour, trying to remember the taste of acorn cakes they would never make again. Old men carving toys for grandchildren, toys that resembled nothing these children had ever seen in their homeland because the children had been born in captivity. Teenagers asking parents to describe mountains they could not imagine, trying to understand why adults wept when talking about places called home. Language was disappearing in real time. Children born at Fort Sill grew up speaking English, understanding Apache only when absolutely necessary. Traditional stories, which could only be told properly in Apache, became simplified versions translated into English, losing their spiritual power in translation. Songs that connected the people to specific places, to particular seasons, to sacred sites, all of them fading as the places they honored became unreachable memories. The most heartbreaking aspect of Fort Sill was how thoroughly it demonstrated the impossibility of cultural preservation in exile. You cannot maintain a desert culture on Oklahoma plains. You cannot teach traditional hunting to children who have never seen the animals their ancestors hunted. You cannot pass down plant knowledge when the plants don't exist in your new environment. You cannot sustain spiritual practices connected to specific mountains when those mountains are 1,000 miles away. General Scott's well-intentioned policies couldn't address the fundamental problem. These people were dying inside, one meal at a time, one day at a time, one generation at a time. The end came for Geronimo in February 1909, in the most undignified way possible for a great warrior. He died of pneumonia after a night of heavy drinking, found unconscious in a ditch by soldiers who carried him to the post hospital. His last words, according to witnesses, were requests to see Arizona one more time, requests that went unfulfilled. They buried him in Apache Cemetery at Fort Sill, grave number 1501 in the prisoner registration system. Even in death, he remained a number in government files, rather than a person with a name that meant something in his own language. But Geronimo's death marked not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. The last of the great Apache war leaders was gone, leaving behind people who faced an impossible choice: adapt completely to American ways, or watch their culture disappear entirely. What none of them could have predicted was that this choice itself was an illusion. Because in 1913, just 4 years after Geronimo's death, the American government would present Apache survivors with a decision that would scatter them to the winds and ensure that adaptation and cultural preservation would both become nearly impossible. The choice they faced would split families forever and create wounds that their descendants are still trying to heal more than a century later. April 2nd, 1913, mark that date, because it represents one of the cruelest decisions ever forced upon a people who had already endured the unendurable. After 27 years of imprisonment, the United States government finally decided to release the Apache survivors. But like everything else the government had done to these people, the release came with conditions that ensured maximum suffering disguised as generous choice. The choice was this: join the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico, where they could live among related Apache groups but would have to start over with nothing, or accept individual allotments of land in Oklahoma, where they could remain on familiar ground but would receive inadequate plots that could never support traditional lifestyles. Picture the train station at Fort Sill that April morning. Families who had survived everything together, the cattle cars, the Florida prisons, the humid deaths, the forced exhibitions, the slow cultural strangulation, now faced a decision that would separate them forever. Mothers choosing different paths than their adult children, brothers looking at the same information and reaching opposite conclusions about survival. The mathematics of division are simple, but the human cost was immeasurable. 187 Apache people boarded trains for New Mexico, believing that returning to traditional Apache territory offered their best hope for cultural preservation. 84 remained in Oklahoma, clinging to promises that Fort Sill would become their permanent home, not knowing that the Army had already begun planning to expand their artillery training grounds across Apache villages. At the train station, families said goodbye with the terrible knowledge that they might never see each other again. In a culture where kinship networks formed the foundation of identity, this geographical scattering represented a final, devastating blow to social structures that had already been strained beyond recognition. Those who stayed in Oklahoma received their promised land allotments, 160 acres each. Think about that number in context. These were people whose ancestors had moved freely across millions of acres, following seasonal patterns established over centuries. Now they were confined to plots of land barely large enough to graze a few cattle, too small for traditional hunting, too poor for successful farming. The government then sold the communal cattle herd that Apache families had spent 20 years building, sold it without consent and without fair compensation, leaving people who had sacrificed everything to build that herd with nothing but the memory of what they had lost. But the real tragedy was generational, and it was happening slowly enough that nobody fully understood its scope until it was too late. Children raised on government commodity foods, white flour, lard, canned meat, processed sugar, began developing health problems that had been virtually unknown among traditional Apache people. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, dental problems, all the diseases that plague reservation communities today began with that transition from traditional foods to government rations. The connection isn't coincidental. Traditional Apache diets consisted of lean game, wild plants, nuts, and seeds foods that required physical effort to obtain and provided balanced nutrition without processed ingredients. Commodity foods provided cheap calories with minimal nutrition, and they could be obtained without the physical activity that traditional food procurement demanded. Within a generation, you could see the physical transformation. Apache people who had been lean, muscular, and healthy became overweight and sick. But the psychological transformation was even more profound. Languages faded as English dominated daily life. Children attended American schools where speaking Apache brought punishment, so parents stopped teaching it to protect their kids from harm. Traditional plant knowledge disappeared as elders died without being able to pass on information about medicines and foods that didn't exist in Oklahoma. Spiritual practices connected to specific sacred sites became impossible to maintain when those sites were thousands of miles away. Yet resistance persisted, often in unexpected ways. The story of modern Apache cultural revival is remarkable precisely because it seemed so impossible. Young Apache nutritionists began studying traditional food systems, learning to identify wild plants their great-grandparents had used for medicine and nutrition. Grandmothers who had hoarded traditional recipes for acorn stew and pine nut cakes began teaching them to grandchildren who had never seen acorns or pine nuts growing wild. Families started driving hundreds of miles to gather traditional plants in ancestral territories, sometimes crossing multiple state lines to reach locations where specific healing herbs still grew. These journeys became acts of cultural defiance, ways of maintaining connections to homeland despite legal and geographical barriers. The effort to repatriate Geronimo's remains represents this broader struggle in microcosm. For decades, Apache descendants have fought to bring his bones back to Arizona, blocked by military bureaucracy and political complications that seem designed to maintain the original injustice. His grave at Fort Sill has become a symbol of ongoing colonization, a great leader buried in foreign soil because the government that imprisoned him refuses to acknowledge that imprisonment is fundamentally wrong. Contemporary food sovereignty movements connect these historical struggles to current political battles over land rights, water access, and cultural preservation. Young Apache activists understand that the ability to feed yourself according to traditional practices represents the foundation of political independence. You cannot be truly sovereign if you depend entirely on outside sources for sustenance. This brings us back to those tears over fried chicken that seemed so puzzling when we began this story. When warrior Nana wept over that first piece of fried chicken at Fort Sill, he was mourning something more profound than most people understood. He was mourning the severing of a relationship with the land that had sustained his people since time immemorial. That relationship wasn't just about nutrition, it was about identity, spirituality, political autonomy, and cultural continuity. Traditional food systems represented complete worldviews. Gathering plants required intimate knowledge of ecosystems, seasonal patterns, and sustainable harvesting practices. Hunting required spiritual preparation, ethical protocols, and deep understanding of animal behavior. Even the simplest meals connected people to ancestors, to land, to responsibilities that extended far beyond individual nutrition. American comfort food severed all those connections. It reduced eating from a spiritual and cultural practice to simple calorie consumption. It made Apache people dependent on systems they couldn't control, foods they couldn't produce, ingredients they couldn't identify. Understanding this connection helps explain why contemporary food sovereignty work is so crucial to Apache cultural survival. When young people learn to identify traditional plants, they're not just learning botany, they're rebuilding connections to ancestral knowledge systems. When families gather wild foods, they're not just supplementing their diets, they're practicing cultural resistance. The tears over fried chicken were tears of recognition. Nana understood, in that moment, that his people were being fed kindness that would kill them more surely than bullets ever could. Not physical death, necessarily, but cultural death, spiritual death, the death of everything that made Apache people who they were. His descendants work to heal that wound one traditional meal at a time, one plant identification lesson at a time, one ceremony at a time. They understand that sovereignty begins with the ability to feed yourself according to the wisdom of your ancestors, and that political freedom is impossible without cultural continuity. The story of the Apache prisoners isn't just history. It's a blueprint for understanding how colonization works, how cultures survive, and why food sovereignty movements matter for indigenous communities worldwide. Every time an Apache child learns to identify traditional plants, warrior Nana's tears find their answer. Every time families gather to prepare traditional foods, Geronimo's exile ends a little bit. Every time traditional recipes are shared, the cattle cars lose their power to separate families. The desert remembers its children, and slowly, carefully, its children are remembering the desert.